It now gives me great pleasure to introduce my good friend, Professor Sevvandi Jayakody, with whom I have been associated for a great many years. Professor Sevvandi, she's currently a senior lecturer in the University of Wyoming. She is a graduate of the University of California and has a postgraduate diploma in wildlife management and conservation from the Wildlife Institute of India, and a PhD in zoology from the University of Aberdeen in the UK. And subsequently, she has done postdoctoral research in Australia, Scotland, and in Canada. So before she joined the university, she was an assistant director at the Department of Wildlife Conservation, and she continues her deep connections with the Wildlife Department and with the Environment Ministry of in Sri Lanka. She served as a chairperson of the National Mangrove Expert Committee and a member of Commonwealth Blue Carbon Initiative, the National Environmental Council, and she's also director of Environmental Foundation Limited, EFL. Her research interests include coastal ecosystem management and policy and impacts of human disturbance on ecosystem processes and functions. Now, in the recent past, currently, I am associated with her in a project under the umbrella of the WNPS to restore an abandoned prawn farm in Anavilundava Sanctuary that, before it became a prawn farm, was a mangrove. And Sevvandi's talk today, I think, is going to center on the restoration project, because it's a popular pastime for many people. Some time ago, it was planting trees anywhere, just planting, and nobody knows how many of them survived. And then people started also planting corals wherever they would like. And the new thing is planting mangroves here, there, and everywhere, with no concerns for whether they're doing it the right way or not. And I think Sevvandi's talk will show how restoration or replanting should be done. Okay, Sevvandi, you can share your screen and start your talk now. Any questions, please put them on the chat box. When she finishes the presentation, we can go through the questions.
Thank you, Dr. Malik, as always. It's a pleasure when you introduce me, my great friend, partner in crime most of the time. And I'm very happy to talk to all of you today. And actually, over the last 2-3 months, we've been talking a lot about mangroves. I've been delivering several webinars regarding mangroves. So I wanted to do something slightly different, just to make sure that we do this as questions and answers. Because over the years, my experience with mangroves, the curiosity to do things was driven by questions. I don't know whether that gentleman is here in the crowd at the moment. One in particular has been bombarding me with questions. That is Graham Marshall from WNPS. He, Dr. Malik knows very well, is someone who is always having a question. And that actually prompted me to understand that if we can answer these questions, that it'll make sure that we have more people being very passionate about what we do, why mangroves are important, and why it is important to go to those muddy and boggy areas. So today's presentation is very much question and answer kind of a session. And I really encourage all of you to bombard me just like Graham with questions, because I think that through that way, we'll also come to know what we know and what we don't know, and it'll lead us to go back to field and test more things. And saying that, I also thought I will dig up some of the slides that will set the ground for us to talk. And that's quite important. And this morning I was in a meeting in which some climate change scenarios were presented. Dr. Sarath Premalal, former director of Department of Met, was presenting some of his findings where he was indicating the likely climate scenarios for Sri Lanka. We were looking at the drought intensity map and understanding for the first time how the mountain zone of Sri Lanka is going to be very vulnerable to the droughts, plus some of the coastal areas. Along with that, we were also discussing about the latest document that IPCC has come up with, where we have been warned for countries like Sri Lanka, the sea level rise could be as tall as 2 meters. So the current IPCC report is actually a very bleak report, something for the first time IPCC is using certain terminologies for us to very concretely understand climate change is now in motion and that it is actually making changes to the global cycles, including the warm currents, cold currents, and also to the other weather patterns. So in a situation like this, more than ever, we need to go into coastline. Why? Because we are an island. Why? Because coastline is the very first line of defense for us. Anything that happens in the coastline will affect everything that happens in the mountain areas too. Therefore, the current IPCC report is a grim reminder for us to know we should have done this 50 years ago. We didn't do it. Fine. We didn't do it yesterday. Fine. But we can do it from today onward. And certainly there is a tomorrow that we can act. And my discussion today with you is to mobilize you, not just to make you listen and to feel bad about it. We need an army of people that are willing to get their feet muddy, that are willing to take the challenge and go out and do it. So at the end of this presentation, if I see an army of new people that are passionate to do this thing, we will all be a winner. And so with that in my mindset, let me start. I have a few slides that I would like to take you through. But more than that, I have another rather very important document. Dr. Malik, myself, and some of you were there last Friday, not the last Friday, the Friday before, when we were trying to validate the national guidelines for mangrove restoration. I would like to talk you through why these guidelines are coming and why these guidelines are important. Even before I start sharing my slides, I must also tell you the interest about mangroves in this country was initiated by one fatal event, the tsunami, last tsunami, in which we understood areas where we had mangroves were resilient, less damages, to human life as well as to property. And that prompted globally to invest on mangroves, to think about mangroves. However, that was not sufficient because we are very good at forgetting. What happened is very easily forgotten. And I wouldn't blame anyone for that, but that can happen. With time, the emerging evidences are compelling us, urging us to go into mangroves, not just because it's the first line of defense in terms of combating storm surges and tsunamis, but it seems now, when you look at most of the ecosystems that we study about, coastal ecosystems, mainly mangroves, seagrass beds, and salt marsh vegetations, are the champions of carbon sequestration, sequestering carbon 4 times more than the mighty tropical rainforests. So someone might wonder how a seagrass bed with such small number of species, seagrass not being very big, something not as visible as tropical rainforests, can do that, but it is. That's what the science says so. So that is another important thing for us to remember, why we need to invest on mangroves and seagrass beds and salt marshes. This morning, I was reading another paper that just came out from, it just was published in Nature. And that article talks about cost benefit analysis of investing to different ecosystems. If you spend $1, how much you are going to get back? And they have very nicely argued and indicated, in terms of cost benefit analysis, investing on mangroves is the best investments for future. So knowing that, I think it's quite important that we come to know about mangroves, and not just that, but also learn how to restore these systems that we had been ignoring for a long time. So with that setting, let me now take some of the slides that I have prepared in order to set the ground for today's discussion. Thank you. Let me start sharing the screen. Hope my screen is clear to all of you. Dr. Malik?
It's clear. It's clear.
Thank you. Why am I doing this webinar today? I'm doing this webinar today to all of you, to this learned society, and to the members that are listening here, to first tell you that restoration is costly and it's time consuming. And that's exactly why it is important to do it with scientific evidence. Otherwise,
Sevvandi, you're muted.
I'm sorry, I'm challenged by a computer, very smart computer. So this is one reason why I'm struggling today with my slides. I'm really sorry about it, but I understand that these computers are super smart, not made for people like me. So here we are. Why this webinar? Let me start by that. I'm talking to a very learned society today, and everyone that are here, you all are experts in your own right, in your own disciplines. When it comes to mangroves, the very first thing that I want to tell you all is that restoration of mangroves is a costly affair, because we talk a lot about mangrove restoration, very little about mangrove conservation now. Restoration is costly and it's very time consuming. And very importantly, unless it's conducted with scientific evidence, it's going to be an utter waste of resources. And we have documented evidence for that. There's a publication that has come up, done by Professor Jayakody, Dr. Kodikara, and the others, that have documented that we've spent millions of dollars in Sri Lanka in the name of mangrove restoration, but most of them are failed projects. And that's the very first thing that we need to remember. Therefore, the very first thing I would like to do today is I want to talk about some of the concepts underpinning restoration. Because when we know them, it's very easy for us to go forward. And then later, I would like to talk about some of the steps that should be followed in a restoration process. And finally, very importantly, why we need to learn from nature, because nature-based solutions still seems to be the best way to go forward. How do we give this little nudge to go forward in order to let the nature take the way restoration forward? I urge all of you to read some of the material that are out there. These three documents, especially the State of the World's Mangroves 2021, is a very important document. Please go through it, because most of the graphics that I use today here are very much based on the outcomes in that latest publication. Then there's lots of lessons that are out there, and I have indicated a publication that have come up. It's a very important document for all of us to read. Though done in 2012, the outcomes are still very valid. There's also mangrove restoration guides that are available. Yet I'm going to introduce you to the national guidelines that are being done by the Ministry of Environment at the moment. And I think they are going to be pivotal in changing the way that we do restoration at the moment. So if I look at my last presentation about mangroves, in my last presentation about mangroves, that was done few months ago. I was talking about mangroves with the Young Zoologists Association. And when I was talking to the Young Zoologists Association, I was showing them some of the distribution maps that have been prepared. But I'm showing you something different today. 2021 data, which talks about either the gain or the loss of the mangroves, global gain or the loss of the mangroves. Because as you can see, the scenarios are different. There are certain areas where the mangroves are gaining at the moment. And this is partly because of the climate change. Partly because certain areas are becoming warm enough for mangroves to disperse into new areas and to colonize. And you can see that. But if you look at where the mangroves are historically, which is the tropics and the subtropics, you can see we are talking about the loss of mangroves. Red indicating 100% loss of mangroves. And as of 2021 data, we are talking about 136,000 square kilometers, not a large amount globally. if you look at Sri Lanka itself, of this 136,000 square kilometers, Sri Lanka's mangrove cover, we are talking about a maximum of 19,000 hectares, a small amount compared to many other ecosystems in Sri Lanka. Yet, this 136,000 square kilometers are the home for the livelihoods for many. If you take fisher folk only, globally, 4.1 million fisher folks fishing in mangroves. So can I think of any other reason why we need to restore mangroves? No need of thinking any other reason, because if you think only about fisher folk, displacement of the mangroves, destroying of mangroves is also displacing 4.1 million fisher folk from their livelihoods. And that is one good reason why we need to invest on mangroves. This map here, global map, shows you primary drivers of change. What drives mangroves degradation? And if you look at it, you can see from erosion to extreme events are responsible. Thanks to some of the ongoing global mapping, most of this information are available at a very finer scale, as you can see for certain areas. Let's go to Sri Lanka. You can see all around Sri Lanka, what we see as the main reason for the loss is non-productive conversion. And what are these non-productive conversions? Here in Sri Lanka, our non-productive conversions are mainly converting of our mangroves into saltons, into shrimp farms. This has been happening for a long time, and it is ongoing. Is the threat over? No. Threat is very much active, and we tend to convert our mangroves for non-productive commercial entities as I'm speaking. So that is another key point I wanted to discuss. This is also quite an important thing. Why? Because earlier I was talking about 136,000 square kilometers of mangroves globally. If you look at South Asia, compared to the rest of the world in square kilometers, we are not talking about a large amount of mangroves. South Asia, 8,414 square kilometers of mangrove only. So why is then South Asia is the place to go when it comes to conservation of mangroves? Although it is 8,414 square kilometers of mangroves in South Asia, South Asia and the rest of the Asian countries are very important, basically because of the diversity. If you look at mangroves, we tend to talk about what we call the true mangroves and the associates. What are these true mangroves? These are the mangrove plants, species, flora, plants that tend to live in this special ecosystem only. They are adopted to be there. So that's why they are known as true mangroves. They can't survive anywhere else. Associates are the other flora, other plants that tend to mix with the true mangroves. When you look at the true mangrove diversity globally, the statistics vary because we scientists always love to argue about what is a true mangrove and what is not. But the number goes from something like 53 to 71 are recognized as true mangroves. And if you go by those statistics, 1/3 of the true mangroves are found in Sri Lanka. 21 species to be exact. And this is one reason why South Asia is important. Despite the area, South Asia is important because of the high diversity, not because of that. It's also because of the amount of mangroves that are protected. You can see when it comes to protection, different parts of the world have given greater protection. Like in South America, you can see 74% of the mangroves are protected. And if you go to Pacific Islands, where mangroves are so unique because these are very much coastal mangroves, only a fraction is protected. And when you look at East Asia and South Asia, you can compare and see why it is so important that you not just look at the extent, the species diversity, but also get an idea about the level of protection we have given. So these statistics are very, very important for us to understand what we have to do next. Here in Sri Lanka, when we look at the mangrove cover, these 19,000 square kilometers, 19,000 hectares are dispersed all around the country, in particular associated with the river network. So you can see wherever we have a major river mouth, you have associated mangroves. So Trinco Kinya area associated with River Mahavali. If you look at Kalawaya Basin, associated with River Kalawaya, so on and so forth, with each and every major river and each and every major lagoon, we have mangroves. But why do we talk about it? Is it because we have a very small area? No, it's not because of that. This picture that you see here, it was taken on a very interesting day. This year, World Mangrove Day celebrations happened in Eastern Coast. I was on my way to Eastern Coast. On the way, we went to a location to look at mangrove restoration. Forest Department is conducting mangrove restoration in that area. Just the northern part of Batikalo Estuary Lagoon. So while we were on that way, Road Development Authority is going to come up with a new bridge. This is the very first thing they have done, clearing the area, cutting off some of the prime mangroves that are there quite unnecessarily, because the bridge was coming somewhere else. This destruction was done on some other part. So this is another reminder for us to remember, planting a mangrove is not a solution when we change or destroy an entire ecosystem, which has its own benefits, its own services. So that's why I have the current mangrove distribution of the country in one side, and also a picture to let you know, in addition to the greater damages that we do through saltants and aquaculture, there is also this kind of haphazard development that is happening, destroying our mangroves. Yet, as I mentioned earlier, Sri Lanka's mangroves are firmly tied to the livelihoods. This photo taken by Mr. Samantha Gunasekara shows you how mangroves are the prime livelihood for fishermen in Kalawaya Basin. It's not just the livelihood, It is their tradition, their way of life. So the moment you preserve mangroves, you are preserving the way of life of some of the communities of this country. This is exactly why restoration should be driven by science. Unless restoration is driven by science, we will not be able to do restoration properly. In order to understand that the restoration should be driven by science, we also need to understand that to embrace the concept of restoration, we need to understand different elements of restoration. I extracted this beautiful graphic from the earlier book I was talking about, Status of the World's Mangroves 2021 book. And I urge all of you to read it. It's a very nice book. And you can see, if we are to use science for the restoration, we need to remember there are multiple users in here, from primary consumers to filter feeders, those who decompose every leaf that falls in, those who live on the top of the sediments, those who live under the soil, infauna and the epifauna, those who seasonally come in, either from the coast, either from the sea, or from the rivers, seasonally coming into the system, either to breed and sometimes reach in there because it's kind of a clinic. Certain fish species, when their skins are laden with parasites, tend to enter to lagoons because the salinity differences kill the parasite load. So that lagoon is the clinic in which they get a chance to get rid of the parasites and then go back. We need to understand these things. Then only we will be able to do the restoration correctly. Then only we will be able to think about how do we go ahead with restoration beyond mere planting. Very importantly, we also need to remember that in these great ecosystems, inside mangrove forests, there's above ground communication as well as below ground communication, about which we know very little about. Soil fungi in particular tend to connect these trees, take in messages like a neural system, connecting the trees, making sure that they stay healthy. So restoration is not complex, but understanding that every aspect, all these aspects got to be understood and paid attention before we go ahead with restoration. So ecological restoration, in my opinion, is a complex thing. We can recreate. I'll talk about it very soon. We can initiate or we can accelerate the recovery of an ecosystem. Why do we want to do it? We do it if the disturbances have affected the structure and the functions and the services these ecosystems render to us. Then we go forward and talk about restoration. But before we do that, Dr. Malik knows this slide very well. I used it before during an interview. I would like all of you to spend a moment looking at these words, because these are the words that we come across on a daily, day-to-day basis when we talk about mangrove restoration. And what are these words? Ranging from afforestation to reintroduction. I have given the meanings of these words here. Why did I sort of like in a school lecture, like in a university lecture, come up with these words? Because these words matter a lot. Unless we know these words, we can make mistakes. The one on the top is very, very important. Afforestation. Why? Afforestation is establishing a new ecosystem onto a land that was formerly not what is planned. In other words, if we tend to think mangroves are important and then go out tomorrow and try to come up with mangroves in each and every area along the coastline, that's afforestation. And we shouldn't do it, because half the time, many unsuccessful restorations that have happened in this country are because either we have gone and planted mangroves in a salt marsh, which is a different, very unique ecosystem, or in a mud flat, which is again another different ecosystem. So afforestation is not the thing we need to do. Out of different words, ANR, or accelerated natural regeneration, is the most famous or most important word for me, because that's what the world is trying at the moment, looking for science to come up with accelerated natural regeneration, where we do the least amount of job and then allow the nature to do the job. That is very, very important. Accelerated natural regeneration. So finding the right management actions always enable us to do that. Accelerated natural regeneration can be done only if we know the complexities associated with mangroves. As you can very clearly see in this video, let me allow you to enjoy it first. I want you to have a look at the complexities associated with fringing mangroves. It itself looks like a dike, a kind of a wall, hardly penetrable. And you can also see how those mangroves, in this case Rhizopora, you can see mostly, have evolved to live with water, rise in tides twice a day. And along with that, how these mangroves have evolved to ensure that from coming up with seeds, fruits that will germinate on the tree itself. That's the best way to germinate. Why? If it falls, it's falling into water. So the tree ensures the fruit will remain in the tree itself, germinate, turns into a plant, and only when it is ready, it sheds the root seed. So the fruit is already germinated so it can float with the water or sink to the bottom and firmly establish and turn it into a new plant. Accelerated natural regeneration is knowing each and every nitty-gritty of these plants and accordingly coming up with the right choices so that you know the zonation of mangroves, you know what lives near to the water, which plants live further inside, and how susceptible are they to the tides, change in salinity levels, and then accordingly mimicking what the nature does. And that's what accelerated natural regeneration processes tend to attempt. Why is the word accelerated used? Accelerated is used because when we go and disturb a mangrove ecosystem, sometimes when we cut off the access to water by perhaps coming up with a dam or sometimes diverting the water, perhaps it's a matter of opening up the water so that the water flows in back again. Along with the water, these seeds naturally floats in, and along with that, nature decides what plant will grow in what location. And that's very, very important, following the clues of what the nature gives. And it's a daunting task. Here, as you can see, even after 12 years, 12 to 15 years, you can see it's a barren place, a salton, an abandoned salton. Acid sulfate soil that has been disturbed does not allow any plant to come in. How do we promote accelerated natural regeneration in a place like this? How do we turn a system of that nature into something like this? What you see here before 2019 looks like this now, thanks to some of the really good efforts of Department of Forest. I applaud the Department of Forest by taking these initiatives and promoting accelerated natural regeneration and learning from the nature in order to do the right things. And that's why I mentioned scientific restoration is the way to go. And in order to do that, we have to learn about the lives of mangroves, the secret lives of mangroves, their likes and dislikes, their zonations. They are very fuzzy. They tend to grow where the optimal conditions are. And only when you know it, then only you can create that right system. I was talking about afforestation earlier. Here's a very good example. Many mangrove restorations in this country have happened in systems like this, because to layman's eye, this is a barren land. Not just to layman's eye. I can even quote you, some of the scientists have sometimes dubbed these areas as barren land. But this is not a barren land. This is a salt marsh. During the dry season, it may look very barren, but when the right conditions comes, when all the salt marsh species come along, you see the changed ecosystem. So if someone thinks, here's a nice ground for us to go ahead and do mangrove restoration, you are totally mistaken. Don't think about it, because this is an important ecosystem. It's in own right. And you can even see some of the mangroves that are associated with it, like Avicennia marina here. So we should always remember afforestation is something we should not think of. Here's another big disaster up in the north. I took this photograph for you to understand sometimes some beautiful areas that looks like prime areas for mangrove restoration are not actually there for mangrove restoration. Mangroves will come here thanks to us because we have taken it forcibly and grown it there. But this is not a mangrove area. Mangroves have never been in that area. This actually is an important area for sea cucumbers. If we tend to go ahead and plant mangroves in areas like this, you are actually taking the livelihood of some people away, plus doing unnecessary changes to the coastline of Sri Lanka. Therefore, it's so important to do the right assessment before you think of mangrove restoration. Sometimes accelerated natural regeneration does not need planting at all, does not need human intervention at all. Maybe the only human intervention that you require perhaps would be simply coming up with a fence to stop the former disturbances. Narikuda, in this case, of Mana, Achankulam Narikuda area. Again, Forest Department, you can see the boundary posts of Forest Department. All that has been done is to come up with a sturdy fence and to spend on two people that are actually safeguarding the fence from the community itself. So livelihood for two people to ensure that this fence is taken care of and to make sure that the goats and the cattle that enter from the lagoon are sort of like shooed off. That's all that is being done. Why? Because the fence itself is sufficient to make this change. In the absence of grazing, nature takes over. Nature does the job. You can see the difference between outside the fence and inside the fence. So what I wanted to tell you is accelerated natural regeneration does not need complicated engineering, raising nurseries, spending a lot of money. Sometimes, not always. You need to assess. But when you do like that, here's a good example in Narikuda itself. I took this photo last year. Nature deciding which plants should come up and where. After the fruiting season, Abyssinia marina, which is the dominant species in that area, have come up with the water channels, and they've established not all these plants will survive. The fittest will survive, and the fittest will then create the right condition in order to let the others come in. And all we need is the patience and ensure that nature does the job. Sometimes restoration is working with people, ensuring that people understand their livelihoods depend on the right restoration of the ecosystem. Here in Mutupanthia, these shrimp farmers, their bounties, their Penaeus monodon culture depends on the healthy mangroves in the surrounding. Why? Because white spot syndrome is a big issue for them. If you really don't mind, give me a minute. I just want to say good night to my son. Assam, in a lecture. I'll get back to you if you give me a minute. I'm really sorry about it. So there we go. Here in Mutupantia, all we had to do, or all we are supposed to do, is to work with these communities so that they become a part of the restoration process. Because for them, every healthy mangrove patch in between two farms is the guarantee that the white spot syndrome or any other viral disease does not come to their farm, and that their farm is taken care of. And in situations like that, working with communities are very important. Myself and President Jayasinghe, who actually made me go into these areas, President Jayasinghe, I thank him for giving me that opportunity. How many of you have seen the bitter reality after harvesting? This is what it is like. After harvesting, each pond has tons of unused or unconsumed feed plus shrimp feces. This concoction, unless managed properly, can ruin the lagoon, ruin the mangroves, and even ruin the shrimp farm in itself. What do you need to do with people in a situation like this? To convince them that the nature's remedy to bring back the water to the right level, to make sure the sediments are sort of back to the normal level, is perhaps to come up with mangroves in their inlets and outlets. Why? Because if you come up with mangroves in their inlets and outlets, every time when an aquaculture farm is releasing effluent water, these mangroves have the capacity to change the water quality. They have the capacity to settle all that sediment that comes in from the farms. So I took time to talk about different restoration that we can do. Now you understand, from doing nothing to doing many things are options for us. And in certain instances, doing something involves people. Again, here in the Eastern Coast, Forest Department has come up with restoration in this area with a model. What is the model? People are allowed to go ahead and do fishing, provided that they keep the area clean. Because one of the biggest problems to the mangroves in Eastern Province had been plastic and polythene and waste dumping. So working with the people, convincing them, we are planting and we are trying to restore your mangroves, but you also have a duty to keep it clean, is working. As you can see, again, this year when we were visiting, you can see this fisherman here fishing in a clean mangrove area in which the replanted mangroves are also popping up, coming up. And people understanding that working with government entities has enabled them to continue their livelihood, but not always. Sometimes restoration can be costly, as you see here in Anavilundava, where from the government coffers, Department of Wildlife Conservation has spent a lot of money to make these physical changes, to bring back the hydrology that was once lost, to bring in the sediment that will enable the mangroves to settle in. So you can see the Carson farm, which was abandoned as far as I know from even before that, 1994. As you can see, all the abandoned farms, that's nothing, very few vegetation. But this used to be all mangroves formerly. Why is Department of Wildlife Conservation going to come up with mangroves here? Is it for biodiversity? Is it because it's a Ramsar wetland? No. Look at the other side of Dutch Canal. The other side of Dutch Canal is all very much active shrimp farms. Healthy mangroves in this side is their bank of investment to have the right water quality. Healthy mangroves in this side is also the bank of investment for all the artisanal fishermen that are using traditional fishing gear in this Dutch Canal looking for shrimp. So from doing nothing, we can end up into systems like this. And this is where we need to take over, not waiting until the government goes forward and does things. And in situations like that, private partnerships with the government are very much required. As I speak, Wildlife and Nature Protection Societies has signed an MOU with Department of Wildlife Conservation, and they are talking to leading private sector agencies to join with them to take each and every plot of here for restoration. I think it's very important we go into systems like that. And that's the way to go forward with mangroves. And I think with that, before I go into talking about the guidelines, which I would really like to introduce, I would like to stop here and then take any questions that you have. And at the very latter stage, I will again would love to show you the guidelines that have come up with. And I would also like to emphasize why it is important we all rally with Ministry of Environment to do all these things. And I would also like to conclude that at this moment, we all might think the worst things are happening with the nature. Here in Sri Lanka, we might all feel very depressed. Many decisions taken about our fauna, flora, ecosystems are very, very depressing. But here's a ray of light. I always say, let's look at the positive side. While all the bad things are happening, we've got the mangrove policy adopted. We've got the National Action Plan coming up. We've got the restoration guidelines under validation, which will be finalized on 15. We've got agencies now coming into restoration models. So there's things to smile. Let's smile while fighting for every other environmental injustice. I think that's very important. Environmental justice is something that we have to be very passionate about. I can see Mr. Ravi Algam here, from whom I have learned a lot why it's important to stay passionate about environmental justice. And we have to equally stay passionate for making sure we do these things and stay positive. With that, let me conclude. And I'm happy to take all the questions that you have. Thank you.